Ecologists assign each organisms to a feeding level, or what we call the trophic level, okay, depending on its source of nutrients. Okay, we can broadly classify living organisms as producers and consumers. Okay, so what do you mean by producers? Producers are sometimes called autotrophs, okay, because they are capable of making their own food. That's why it says there it's auto, which means self, okay? So self feeders, okay? They make their nutrients they need from compounds and energy obtained from their environment. So they are capable of making their own food, okay? So how they make their own food? So mostly producers are plants or green plants which are capable of doing the process called photosynthesis, which the plants capture the solar energy that falls on their leaves and use it in the combination of carbon dioxide and water to form organic molecules, which is what we call the glucose plus the oxygen. Okay, and this glucose now is the energy-rich carbohydrates, which store the chemical energy that plants need. Okay, so this is now the chemical formula for the glucose. Okay, so this is the chemical formula for carbon dioxide, and you have the water plus the input of the solar energy, which the plants can make now the organic molecules, which is the glucose, which stores the chemical energy that plants need. Okay, so, today, okay, most producers on land are trees and other are green plants. So in freshwater and ocean ecosystems, algae and aquatic plants growing near shorelines are the major producers. Okay, so as what you have seen in the shorelines, especially if you're going to the beach, the green plants there are actually made up of, or the green aquatic plants there are actually the algae. Okay, so they are also capable of producing their own foods by photosynthesis. So mostly green plants and trees are capable of uh, are capable of doing a photosynthesis or making their own food by producing glucose. Okay. In open water, the dominant producers are the phytoplankton. Okay, and these are mostly microscopic organisms that float or drift in the water. So what is the dominant producers in the open water? What we call it, what do we call that? That is what we call the phytoplankton. So these are microscopic. That means you cannot see it with your own naked eye. So you need to have a microscope in order that you can see these phytoplanktons. Okay, so they float or drift in the water. Okay, so another one in the classification of the uh, on the classification of the organisms is we have the consumers. Okay, so other organisms in an ecosystem are what we call the consumers. That means they are heterotrophs. Okay, so they cannot produce their own foods. That's why by photosynthesis, that's why they need to get their foods by feeding other organisms. Okay, so it could be that they have to feed with the producers, okay, or other consumers, okay, or their wastes and remains, okay. So they can also feed with their wastes or their remains, okay. So we will know that later on. So what are these consumers that feed on their wastes and on their remains, okay. So there are several types of consumers. We have the primary consumers. Okay, so primary consumers involves they are actually herbivores. Okay, so they are herbivores because they are the ones that who will feed to the producers. Okay, the producers are the plants. So after that is we have the primary consumers because they are the ones that will consume first the producers. Okay, that's why they are herbivores. They only eat plants. Okay, and other and herbs. Okay, so animals that eat mostly green plants are what we call the herbivores, or they are plant eaters. So examples are caterpillars, giraffes, and zooplankton. Okay, so zooplankton are the ones that feed on the phytoplankton, which actually I already discussed lately. Okay, so the phytoplankton, which is the microscopic organisms which are capable of producing its own food, and it's found on the floating or drift in the surface of the water, okay, or in the ocean. Okay, so the zooplankton are the tiny sea animals that feed on the phytoplanktons. Okay, so we have also the carnivores. The carnivores are the meat eaters. Okay, they are the animals that feed on the flesh of other animals. And some carnivores, such as spiders, lions, okay, and most small fishes are secondary consumers. Okay, so they are the ones. So what we mean by secondary consumers is that they feed on the flesh of the herbivores or the primary consumers. So first we have producers, then after that we have primary consumers, and the one that feeds on primary consumers are the secondary consumers, which are actually carnivores. Okay, so other carnivores such as tiger, hawks, and killer whales are tertiary, or they are now in higher trophic level consumers, okay, that feed on the flesh of herbivores and other carnivores, okay, and some of these relationships are as shown on these figures, okay. But before I will show the figure, we have also what we call the omnivores, okay. So it's different from carnivores, okay. Omnivores are capable of feeding both plants and animals, okay. Like, for example, we humans. Humans are omnivores. Pigs and rats are also omnivores. Okay? So, as we can see on this last one, okay? So, before I go to the figures, okay? So, the last types of consumer is what we call the decomposers. Okay? So, the decomposers are consumers that in the process of obtaining their nutrients or release nutrients from wastes of remains of plants and animals and return those nutrients to the soil, water, and air for reuse by producers. Okay, so they are the ones that decompose the dead body of the producers or the consumers. Okay, so when the consumers dies or the producers dies, they are actually decomposed by the decomposers, and mostly decomposers are bacteria and fungi. Okay, so other consumers are also called the detritus feeders or the detritivores. So what are these detritus feeders? From the root word detritus, which means dead bodies, okay, they are the ones that feeds the dead bodies, okay, or the wastes of other organisms. And examples of the detritivores or detritus feeders are the worms, hyenas, and vultures, okay. So hordes of detrivores are decomposers that can transform a fallen tree trunk into wood particles, and finally uh, into simpler inorganic molecules that plants can absorb as nutrients. So they are the ones that will decompose, like for example, this wood tree trunk, okay? So they will decompose this into fine particles, which are actually enables the plants on the surrounding of this dead trunk, okay, of this dead tree trunk. Okay, so the ones that are produced by the decomposers will be absorbed by the plants, which will act as its nutrients or raw materials for it to grow, multiply, and also reproduce. Okay, thus in natural ecosystems, the wastes and dead bodies of organisms serves as resources for other organisms, in keeping with the chemical cycling, which is the principle of the sustainability. Okay, so without the decomposers and detritivores or the detritus feeders, the planet would be overwhelmed with plant litter, animal wastes, dead animal bodies, and garbages. So imagine if there are no decomposers. So the earth will be overwhelmed with so much of the wastes from the environment, which are the dead bodies, the animal wastes, and the garbages. Okay, so producers, consumers, and decomposers use the chemical energy stored in glucose and other organic compounds. Okay, so through the process of the what we call the aerobic respiration. Okay, so what is this aerobic respiration? So aerobic respiration, they uses the oxygen to convert the glucose and other biomolecules back into carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so remember that your primary, the producers will be the one that will uh, produce the glucose. Okay, so which is its primary energy rich. Okay, on its system now. Okay, the glucose for the producers. When the primary consumers eat the plants, okay, it has now its glucose on its body. Okay, and that glucose will be used for the consumers to undergo what we call the aerobic respiration for the consumers to move, okay, to have energy, okay, in seeking food, in feeding, or doing its work, okay, and how they are going to make use of this glucose that they receive from the producers is that when this glucose is actually uh, undergoes reaction with the presence of the oxygen because animals inhales oxygen, okay, and especially humans. When we inhale oxygen, the glucose inside our body will now be converted into back into carbon dioxide and water, and also releases a tremendous amount of energy, which actually we need that energy for us to move, for us to work, okay, so that we can go to work, we can go to school, we can move, we can seek, we can find food, okay, we can think, okay, so that energy that is actually produced by the aerobic respiration is the ones that makes all the consumers to move and uh, to find foods, okay, so that's it. So the process is actually we have the this is actually opposite of the photosynthesis. Okay, so in photosynthesis you have your carbon dioxide, water plus water and solar energy, so that you will produce glucose and oxygen. But in aerobic respiration, it's opposite. Okay, if you have glucose plus oxygen, then it will be converted back into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Okay, so it's actually that's why this process, or this process like photosynthesis and the aerobic respirations are just what we call it's also an important application on chemical cycling. Okay, so remember that your solar energy will be input or will be absorbed by the plants, and if you have carbon dioxide that is coming from the consumers, okay, it will be also be absorbed by the plants to produce a glucose, and these glucose are actually being used up by the primary consumers and the other consumers, secondary consumers or tertiary consumers, okay, which actually they need for energy, okay. So they use up that glucose for energy, and when all of this and aerobic respiration also uh, produces carbon dioxide, okay, it will go to the atmosphere, and also it will also absorb by the plants again, okay. So another, if the animals or the consumers dies, it will be decomposed by the bacteria, and this process of decomposition will also release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and which also be used up by the plant. So as you have noticed here on this diagram, it's actually a cycling, okay, of the nutrients. So all of the wastes that are actually involved or in the environment becomes a raw materials for other organisms. Okay, that's why there is what we call the interdependence on the ecosystem. Okay, now let's move to the next topic, okay, which is actually talks the food chains and food webs. Okay, so what happens to energy in an ecosystem? So as energy flows through ecosystems in food chains and food webs, the amount of high quality chemical energy available to organisms at each successive feeding level decreases. Okay, so we will now go to the energy flows in an ecosystem, okay, by 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 describing the food chains and the food webs, okay. So the chemical energy stored as nutrients in bodies and wastes of organisms flows through ecosystems from one trophic level, okay, to another. So a sequence of organisms, each of which serves as source of nutrients or energy for the next, is what we call the food chain. So as we can show here in this figure, this is a uh, simple food chain. Okay, so you have your solar energy, okay, which the solar energy needed by the plants, which is the producers, and the first trophic level. Okay, so the plants now need that solar energy to produce its own food. Then you have your primary consumer. For example, you have your caterpillar, which feeds on that plant. Okay. And you have your secondary consumer, which feeds on the primary consumer. And you have your tertiary consumer, which feeds on the secondary consumers, okay? And all of these producers and consumers will eventually, when they die, they will be decomposed by the decomposers and the detritus feeders. And all of them are actually releases heat on the environment, okay? So every trophic levels, the energy is actually being released. Okay, that's why there is a decrease on the energy as we go further on the trophic level. Okay, so every use and transfer of energy by organisms involves loss of some high quality energy to the environment as low quality energy in the form of heat, in accordance with the second law of the thermodynamics. Okay, so remember the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, the energy is actually lost whenever we were going to use up something. Okay, whenever we process something, energy is actually lost back to the environment. Okay, so in natural ecosystems, most consumers feed on more than one type of organisms, and most organisms are eaten or decomposed by more than one type of consumer. And because of this, there is what we call the interconnected food chains, or what we call the food web. So the food web is the complex network of interconnected food chain. So what is the example of the food web? So this is what it looks like. Okay, as you can see, these are some organisms are eaten, okay, or feed on by more than one type of organisms. Okay, so like for example, your Adelie penguin, okay? So, your Adelie penguin can be fed by the leopard seal or by the killer whale, okay? So, they are actually feed on with more than one type of organism. So, they are actually interconnected food chains, okay? Especially your squid can be fed on with uh, different types of organisms, okay? So, this is now what we call the food chain, a food web, okay? So food chains and food webs show how producers and consumers and decomposers are connected to another as energy flows through trophic levels in an ecosystem. Okay, so the pyramid of energy flow illustrates energy loss for a simple food chain, assuming 90% of energy loss with each transfer. So how do we do that? Okay, so for example of this one, okay, you have your producers. If its available energy is in 10,000, okay, so if we go to the next trophic level, which is the primary consumer, so 90% of 10,000 is 9,000, okay, so that means 90% of energy is lost. So 10,000 minus 9,000, so therefore 1,000 has already been available as energy for the first for the second trophic level, which is the primary consumers. Okay, then 1,090% of that is what? 900. Okay, so 1,000 minus 900 is 100. Okay, that is now available for the second consumers, which is the third trophic level. And 90% of 100 is 90, so 100 minus 90 would now be 10. Okay, which is now the available energy for the next consumer, or the tertiary consumer. So that is what the pyramid of energy flow is. Okay? So some ecosystems produce plant matter faster than others do. Okay? By doing this, or we can describe ecosystems which produce matter faster than the others, okay, by GPP and NPP. Okay, so what is this GPP and NPP? So GPP means the gross primary productivity. So it's the rate at which an ecosystem's producers, usually plants, convert solar energy into chemical energy stored in compounds found in their tissue. So in gross primary product, it's actually an ecosystem. Okay? So it's the whole ecosystem. So whoever are the producers, or whatever are the producers in the whole ecosystems, so the rate at which those producers convert solar energy into chemical energy stored in compounds, okay, are what we call the gross primary product. Okay, so to stay alive, grow, and reproduce, producers must use some of their stored chemical energy for their own respiration. Okay? So it's not just the consumers that will benefit on the producers' food, okay, or the producers making food, okay, but also producers use some of its stored chemical energy for the producers to move, to reproduce, to grow, or to stay alive, okay? And the net primary productivity, or NPP, is a rate at which producers, so it talks about only the producers, okay? So it's not the ecosystem anymore, it's the individual producer, okay? The producers use photosynthesis to produce and store chemical energy, minus the rate at which they use some of the stored chemical energy through aerobic respiration, okay? So it's the producers minus uh, minus it uses some of its stored chemical energy. Okay, that is now the net primary productivity. Okay, for gross productivity, it only talks about the total uh, uh, the total chemical energy stored on the ecosystems producers. But if you have your net primary productivity, we are going to subtract it with the 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 we will going to subtract it with the producers, the stored chemical energy that the producers use through aerobic respiration. Okay, so that's why it's called the net. So NPP measures how fast producers can make the chemical energy that is stored in their tissues that is potentially available to other organisms, okay? Because some of the stored chemical energy will be used up by the producers for it to stay alive, reproduce, and grow, okay? And other stored chemical energy will now be used up by the consumers, okay? So, terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic life zones differ in their NPP as illustrated on this figure. Okay? So, in this figure, we will now differentiate the net primary productivity between the terrestrial ecosystems, okay, and the aquatic ecosystems. So, as we can see now, despite its low NPP, okay, the open ocean produces more of the Earth's biomass per year than any other ecosystem or life zone. This occurs because of the enormous volume of our global ocean, which covers the 71% of the Earth's surface and contains huge numbers of phytoplankton and other producers. Okay, so tropical rainforests have a very large number, or a very high net primary productivity, because they have a large number and variety of producers, trees and other plants, which such forests are cleared or burned to make a way for crops or for grazing cattle. They suffer a sharp drop in net primary productivity and a loss of many of their diverse array of plant and animal species. Okay, so so and plant and only the plant matter represented by NPP is available as nutrients for consumers. Okay, so this is actually the availability of the stored chemical energy from the producers, which actually available for the consumers. Okay, so that's it. So this is the differentiation of the net primary productivity between the terrestrial ecosystems and the aquatic ecosystems. So as you can see that the aquatic ecosystems has actually low NPP than the terrestrial ecosystem. Okay, but although that aquatic ecosystem has the low uh, low net primary productivity, okay, but it actually it covers, okay, the 71% of the Earth's surface, okay, but because in aquatic ecosystem only the phytoplanktons are the one that produces the stored chemical energy, okay, and some of it are the algae. But in the terrestrial ecosystem, always remember that you have the tropical rainforest, okay, and the forests that we can see are the ones are very vast and very very big, okay, so that's why a lot of the stored chemical energy will be produced by the terrestrial ecosystems rather than in the aquatic ecosystem, because always remember that phytoplanktons are microscopic organisms, okay, they are not macroscopic just like your trees or plants, okay. So that's it. So that is the difference between the gross primary productivity and the net primary productivity.